Welcome to Big Hearted Indy. I'm your host, Chris Spangle. I'm here with my other hosts. It's their podcast, and we're so fortunate to talk to them and hear from their friendships and networks. It's Don Palmer. Thanks for being here, Don.
Absolutely.
And Greg Enas. Greg, thanks for being here.
Hi, Chris.
And Sajan George is here. Thanks so much for being our guest today. We're excited to hear your story.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with how you know these fellas. So, Greg, why don't you give us an introduction to Sajan and why it's important to talk to him today?
Sajan's become such a dear friend and co-laborer in what God is doing here in Indianapolis. I met Sajan a few years ago through Doug Wilson, who's part of our Citizen 7 network. Doug was engaged with Praxis, and lo and behold, Sajan goes way back with Praxis, an organization that's fostering redemptive entrepreneurship throughout the world. And Sajan can tell you more about that. But it was through Doug here in Indy that I met Sajan, who providentially was moving here to Indianapolis. And we can go into a bit about that story. And the rest is history. We have done life together, and there's a number of things that we'll be touching on in our time of question and response that we'll get into there. But it's been a joy to welcome Sajan, his wife, their 3 children to our community.
Yeah, absolutely. How far back do you want to go, Greg? Do you want to start with
I want to
all the way back to the origin story, or do you want to start when he moved to Indianapolis?
I'd like for Sajan, first of all, to go back just a little bit and tell us some of the background that I know of, but there may be things I always learn on these podcasts too. But we know, and I want the audience to hear some of the wonderful things that you're doing here in our city, what your vision is there relative to the schools that you've brought into our community that are raising human dignity and knowledge and creating ultimately high school graduates now that will go out into the world, making the world a better place, but also your work in the Martindale-Brightwood neighborhood through Polk Stables, but more broadly, your mission through Praxis and what you're doing to foster redemptive entrepreneurship. So if you wouldn't mind, Sajan, go back to your family of origin, some of the lessons learned along the way that have brought you to this point, given that mission of yours that have motivated and animated through both the ups and the downs of life where you are today.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Craig and Don and Chris. Let's see. So my parents were born in India, in the southern state of India called Kerala. And for those of you who may not know, there's a pretty strong Christian minority in Kerala. A little biblical history. India is probably 98% Hindu, but in the state of Kerala, there's at least 20-25% that are Christian, because the Apostle Thomas founded the church in India, in Kerala. He went initially to reach a Jewish outpost, and we can trace our family back at least 7 generations that have that are Christian. So whenever you meet someone with a very Indian-sounding first name like Sajan and a very English-sounding last name like George, or my wife's maiden name is Matthews or Thomas, they're from Kerala and they're Christian. They actually met in the U.S. though. My dad came to study to do his undergrad, master's, and PhD. He was one of 8 siblings, and his father couldn't afford him to go on to higher education. And my dad had a real aptitude, incredibly smart, a real aptitude to learn. And then my mom came as a nurse, and they met and got married here. They met in the U.S., they got married in the U.S., and then my dad's first job after he finished his schooling was either to go back to India because he was on a student visa, or to get a job. And the first job he got was a professorship at a Canadian university. So I ended up growing in a fairly small town called London, Ontario. That's where I was born and raised before I eventually emigrated back to the U.S. as an adult.
That is beautiful. And brought you there. Tell us about your meeting your lovely wife and your kids, and what has transpired, significant milestones in your family's life that ultimately led you to Indianapolis.
Yeah, there's a few. So my wife, she grew up partly in Malaysia and partly here in the U.S. And so we met my wife and I met at one of those Kerala Christian conferences for youths here in the U.S. So once these Keralites emigrate out of Kerala, they stay connected because the history and our faith are just strong, really strong cultural ties. And we met, we got married, we spent our first year of marriage in Australia. I was working for Arthur Andersen. We came back, We lived in Atlanta for a number of years and then eventually made it to Indy. We have 3 children, and all 3 of them have an amazing adoption story. We adopted our oldest out of Memphis, Tennessee. They're all of Indian descent. We adopted our middle son out of Pune in India, and we adopted our daughter out of Calcutta. And they're now 21, 19, and 15, or 16, sorry. But we're actually going back to India this Christmas for the first time since we got our daughter. So they're all going back to their birthplaces. But really just beautiful stories of how God has weaved our family really across continents and across to come together and unite us together as a family. I just fast forward to Indianapolis. So
May I interrupt one thing?
Yeah, please.
Tell us a little bit about your educational and business background that helped motivate what you're going to tell us about in Indy.
Oh, yeah. I actually studied accounting and finance, did a graduate degree, right after grad school, went to work for Arthur Andersen's corporate turnaround group. I would go into companies that were in crisis and help turn them around, restructure them. When Arthur Andersen imploded with the whole Enron scandal, a group of us went over and joined Alvarez and Marcel. They were a purely turnaround and restructuring group, and continued that turnaround and restructuring work for them. And then in 2011, felt a real sense of call from God to start applying my turnaround skills to education. So prior to that, with Alvarez and Marcel, we had this crazy assignment to try to turn around a school district, St. Louis. And for a year, myself and 3 colleagues spent that year trying to turn around how do you fix a broken school system? We didn't know anything about education, but you learn fast. And that first one led to several others. The next one we got assignment was New Orleans. We were there 3 months before Katrina hit. Katrina levels the city, and we spin on a dime and move from a turnaround to basically rebuilding that school system from scratch. There was no infrastructure. Cell towers, you couldn't call people. Cell towers weren't working. We had to stay in makeshift hotels. There were no restaurants. That led to another assignment, New York City. I spent 2 years transforming New York City's public schools under Chancellor Joel Klein, led a team of 25 professional turnaround consultants for a 2-year period, did a few other cities. Fast forward 2011 is when I really felt God saying, I want you to keep using your turnaround skills on education, but I want you to start a separate nonprofit organization. Rather than focusing on large urban school districts, focus on individual schools, because that's where you could create sustainable change. Districts are bureaucratic, heavily unionized. There's an election cycle, so there's a new board every 4 years. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to sustain change over time. But individual schools, you could rally parents. And I started Matchbook Learning in 2011 to turn around the worst performing schools in the U.S. At the time that I was launching Matchbook, Praxis, also a nonprofit, was launching. And through a series of events, I became part of their very first class of what they didn't use this term back then, but redemptive entrepreneurs. So Christians that are launching ventures that are making a significant, or hope to be a significant, influence and impact on the world on a major issue. And so I was in that first class of 12 entrepreneurs, founders, and that had sustained catalyzed a long-term relationship with Praxis. Matchbook was turning around schools in Detroit and Newark. And then in 2017, I moved Matchbook Learning here to Indianapolis. I had done some research and found that, and I couldn't believe it at the time, but I hired these independent consultants. They were based out of California to help school turnaround organizations like myself scale. And they said, the next place you should go to is Indianapolis. It's the number one city for the work you're trying to do. And I was actually we were living in New York City at the time. And I thought, that's crazy. And they said, Sajan.
Where's Indianapolis?
Right. Yeah. I was going to ask, did you have preconceived notions of Indianapolis before you moved here? And then how have those changed as you've been here?
Yeah, great question. So I didn't have any preconceived notions. I came and spent 2 days, met with folks from the mayor's office, folks from Indianapolis Public Schools. The Mind Trust was the philanthropic organization that helped recruit us here. Talked to other charter leaders. I was really impressed. Wow. I had no idea. And part of what was impressive was this is one of the only cities in America where the mayor's office can charter schools. A charter is a license to run a public school. So it's a public school. Any kid is welcome, but it's privately managed. That's the way charter schools work. And I was just super, the mayor had the courage to do that. And they kept expanding that. They introduced some innovative laws here in Indiana that allowed for to do this. You could take the worst performing school and hand it over to a private operator, but the kids and their test scores and their attendance would stay part of the district's enrollment graduation. So if we did well, the district IPS would look well, good. Mm-hmm. And they should. They picked us. Like that's a win. That's common sense. That's like mutually reinforcing, which, let's face it, in public government, there's not a lot of things that make common sense like that. The real turning point for me was 2 months after moving here. We bought a house. We lived in the city, just started getting our feet wet, and it was the final stage of getting our approval from the city council. And they had a changeover in leadership the week before, and there was an interim director who met with me a couple of days before our final hearing, which was really meant to be like the final vote that approves us after many months of due diligence on us. And for a whole variety of reasons that I won't bore the podcast with, he just decided that he wasn't going to move forward with Matchbook. And basically, in no uncertain terms, told me, "You're done." And I said, "We just moved here, we bought a house." And he said, "You're done." And I, again, not knowing anybody in Indy, I went back to our friends at the Mine Trust. I said, "What do I do?" And they said, "Show up. Just show up and bring everybody." And at that point, I knew 2 neighbors, our dog. We started going to a church, Redeemer. I barely knew anybody. And so the handful of people that I knew, I said, "Hey, this is going to sound crazy, but our final court hearings with the city is on Monday. If you could come, I'd really appreciate it. We need support." So we show up, and I'll never forget this. My daughter, Isa, who was, she would have been, I guess, 9 at the time. That morning, she says, "Hey, Dad, if they don't approve us, was it a mistake for us to move here to Indianapolis?" Ugh. And at 9, man, she's old enough to like...
She's a straight shooter, too, from what I can tell.
She's old enough to know truth from falsehood. So I said, I can't lie to her. I said, I don't know. We'll just have to see what happens. Yeah. So we get to it's 5 o'clock. We show up at the courthouse, and it's packed. And before they take a vote, there's a thing called public comments. So people from the public they have to sign their name, and they can make a comment. And then they do the vote. That way, so the public can weigh in on what they feel. And there would have been 20 people who signed up, and just one after another saying, "Matchbook belongs here. The city needs this. This is an innovative model. You need to give them a chance." Like one after the other. There's a line in scripture that says, "Don't worry when you come before kings," I'm paraphrasing, "the Lord will give you the words to say." And that's what I felt. And one guy got up and I've never met Sajan before. And I thought, oh gosh, but I know people who know he and his family, and they need to be here. And so after that, city council was like, "We're doing this." Yeah. So they approved, they all vote us in, and people are high-fiving us afterwards. And I just looked at my wife and looked at my family like, oh, this is home. So
would you agree that this city is willing to try things like that? Let's take a shot at it. It's a little bit of it'll take a chance on something that's maybe out of the box.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Partly, we're not on the coasts, right? We're not New York or San Francisco. And so in some sense, people don't generally flock here from other places, which is usually the negative when you're describing flyover country, obviously. But I will say this, like if you do come here, people are so receptive because you don't have that, that you don't have to fight for. People open up who they know to you. Greg's a great example of that, like just generous with his friendship, but also people he knows. He's constantly introducing me to people, and people like that throughout, like it's a little of that Hoosier hospitality. There's no pretense. If I know someone who can help you, I am going to introduce them to you. I'm not going to take time to vet you for a long time because I'm going to trust in your goodness. And oh my gosh, that is so rare. Other cities and other states talk about hospitality. We don't really promote that here because I think it's just core to the DNA here. It's so intrinsic to how people are that they take it for granted. They don't realize this isn't the way the rest of the country operates. And it's not just on that education piece. And Greg knows this. In my work, I now work full-time for Praxis, managing partner with them. And we're trying to create what we call redemptive entrepreneurship around the world and create ecosystems where small communities are really pushing the redemptive edge on building new ventures. I would say, I'm biased obviously because I live here now, but I think Praxis would agree, like Indianapolis is the most vibrant ecosystem for redemptive entrepreneurship that we have anywhere in the globe, and I have a bird's eye view of what is happening around the world. And it's remarkable. It really is remarkable.
I want to continue on with education, but I want to continue on that train of thought because I'm a beneficiary of kind of the ecosystem that is being built here. The studio is a part of that. At a time when I was struggling, what am I going to do with my career? All of a sudden, I started going to breakfast and met Greg and introduced me to breakfast, and then builders and backers, and met other entrepreneurs. And there's newsletters and events, and now Polk Stables is a great headquarters for those things. Like, it really is amazing to have this sense of, oh, I'm not alone. There are other people who are working on the same problems or want to do business in a different way that isn't exploitative, that isn't just, I'm just trying to treat everybody right, but like actually trying to do some good. So let's talk about redemptive entrepreneurship and the frame of why it's different than maybe just your traditional American capitalist view of make as much profit as possible. What is redemptive entrepreneurship?
Yeah, we define it at Praxis as creative restoration through sacrifice. We choose those words carefully. Our basic mapping of the world is that there are these three planes on which the world operates. Planes or dimensions, if you will. The first and really the most dominant one in our capitalist society is the exploitive plane or the exploitive realm. In game theory, we would say, I win, you lose. Zero-sum game, dog-eat-dog world, right? So you're constantly fighting for market share, and they're clear winners and losers. And in that exploitive realm, you eat what you kill, and that's the way most business works. There's another realm beyond the exploitive, what we would call the ethical realm. So in game theory, if exploitive is I win, you lose, in ethical, game theory would say win, mutuality, do no harm. And we've seen actually in the last maybe 15 years a real rise, a counter rise to the exploitive, which is the ethical, which is basically triple bottom line or social entrepreneurship. It goes by different words. B Corp is another great example. And we would say is the ethical is often God's triumph of common grace, right, over evil. And so we applaud that. We think, oh man, thank God for ethical businesses, social impact, Patagonia, Whole Foods, and others. You can name them off. And redemptive entrepreneurship, the redemptive realm or the redemptive edge is what we call it, because you never totally arrive there, goes beyond the ethical. This is something we think Christians are called to do, is to be more than just ethical, to be redemptive. And again, using game theory, if exploitive is I win, you lose, and ethical is win, the redemptive is I lose, you win. But maybe a better word than lose is I sacrifice, you win. It's true, because until we have a society where everyone flourishes, then we're not really a flourishing society. And what we have seen over 13 years now at Praxis, the pattern recognition that there is a sacrifice, a sacrificial move that unlocks creative potential. And it's in every venture. And that's the redemptive edge that you're called to pursue. So I remember when I was starting out with Matchbook Learning, and I wanted to take this really innovative education model where we were creating individual pathways for individual students. Imagine like a school of one. Every student, we adapt and adjust to what they need. If they're reading at a 4th grade level, we start them there. But if they're doing math at a 5th grade level, we start them there. If they're doing science at the 6th grade level, we start them there. And we progress them as fast as they can go. So the school adapts and adjusts to each individual student rather than the other way around, which is the way 99% of schools operate, which is the kid adapts to the school. You're going to learn math for an hour, then you're going to learn science for an hour, and then you're going to in these blocks, and everybody's going to be going through the same textbook at the same pace and the same sequence. That makes no sense because not all the kids are the same. So the sacrifice was this. We were leveraging technology, these personalized models, but I wanted to go to the bottom 5%. And every funder I was talking to at the time, and we were talking to some major foundations, Gates Foundation, Facebook, etc., they kept saying, innovative model, love it. Why are you wasting your time on those schools? Those bottom 5%, they're rife with challenges and crises and trauma and bad culture and bad teachers. And the list went on. And I was like, but who's going to, those kids you only get one shot at 3rd grade if you're a 3rd grader. Right. You can't wait 5 years and then come back and do 3rd grade. Like and I just felt my Christian calling, which may not make sense in a secular sense, But God leaves the 99 to go after the one. That makes no sense in an economic way. You're better off just tend the 99 sheep. You can afford a loss. If you go after the one, you might lose the 99. That makes no sense in a sort of pragmatic way. But in God's economy, it does because of what he values. And the sacrifice was we were going to try this innovative model and some of the worst performing schools. The school we took over here in Indianapolis was the worst performing school in the city and the state, 6 Fs in a row. It is today the largest K-8 school in the city with over 680 some odd kids. And when we took it over, it was around 300 and they keep coming. Why is that? Because they get it. Just because a majority of our families might live in poverty doesn't mean they don't have high aspirations and high expectations for the kid. But here's the creative thing that got unlocked. Early in Matchbook, in its life and its journey, we were doing something really innovative in the worst performing schools. And we started getting these amazing academic gains and growth. So I started having people from around the country call saying, hey, could we come to your school? I'm like, yeah, come on. We're in Detroit or we're in Newark, wherever we were. And so they would come and then they'd write about us because they said, for these kids to get these kind of academic growths, there must be something about the model. Because had we done this in an upper middle class neighborhood with high parents who were also educated, with lots of parent curricular involvement, then people would say, yeah, okay, I get why Carmel, Indiana has a really high performing school. That kind of makes sense to me. But when you do it in Hawville, people start to go, there's something about the model. And I've always thought that we should be a voice to the voiceless. And so the creative potential here is we started to have a much bigger influence and impact than the actual number of schools that we were doing because people were so intrigued. It disrupted what they thought was possible.
So what would be maybe an example, a story about a teacher at Matchbook or maybe a student that's gone on to high school or college?
We had the student, I remember in Detroit, and she brought her parents in and she sat her parents down and I'll put this as kindly as I can. Her parents are a little bit of a mess. Just a lot of life challenges, a lot of life problems, not completely coherent. And at some point, we tried to have this, do you have any idea about your daughter? And they're like, what do you mean? So we run these adaptive assessments at Matchbook where they're adaptive means that they adjust to the student's ability. So if you get a question, it gives you a harder one. If you get a question wrong, it gives you an easier one. And when you get 3 wrong in a row, the test stops. And then it gives us a score that says, hey, this student, this is what level they're actually functioning at. So we had this 7th grader who was testing out at a 12th grade level, reading and comprehension. And she was way below the poverty line, living in impoverished conditions. And she wants to be a Supreme Court justice one day. I think she will be. That's how smart she was. Our biggest travesty right now in this country is we have a generation of children that have incredible potential, incredible ability, and yet the school that they're in fails to actually recognize it, develop it, and actually let it flourish. So we're wasting millions and millions of people of talent because they won't actually reach their full potential. People that could solve cancer one day, be a Supreme Court justice, invent a new form of electric battery that could last, it could go without a charge for like days. If we can solve the talent challenge that we have, because the graduation rates for these kids in poverty are abysmal. That's why I started Matchbook. They're abysmal. But it's not because they're dumb. It's not because they don't have ability and capacity. It's because they have a series of life challenges that are incredibly hard, but they need to be in relationship, in a loving and safe relationship where they can feel secure, safe and secure to learn. And then you can unlock their potential through relationships, through a personalized, very personal relationship. If we can do that, we can change the talent quotient.
Many of us sitting here are wondering, here's Sajan, who has this incredible heart for the disadvantaged. I don't live in a disadvantaged neighborhood. I didn't grow up disadvantaged. Where did that heart for the disadvantaged, disenfranchised come from? And if we were just having a beer or chatting about things and said, hey, I want to develop that heart, what would you say to me? What actions could I take to say that helped soften my heart up a bit?
A lot of credit goes to my dad. He always did have a particular fondness and passion for the poor. He would talk about it. He would write about it. I felt like growing up, he was always writing checks to people I didn't know, and we'd never see the money again. I will say in my 20s, I was not that. I went to work for a corporate turnaround firm. I was working in downtown Toronto. I think the poor was the farthest thing from my mind. Me not being poor was probably my preoccupation. I would say this, and it's hard to be vulnerable. I'm an Enneagram 3, so that makes it doubly hard. But I think the closer you get to God's heart, the more His heart weighs on yours. So if you want to have passion for the poor, then I think you have to get closer to God's heart. Otherwise, I think it's going to run out of steam. And He's gonna open up your heart. And then when He starts to open up your heart, He's gonna start to open up opportunity. It made no sense for me to leave my corporate turnaround gig as a partner and go start a nonprofit from scratch. It made no sense other than God was calling me to do it. And I wanted to be obedient to that. My advice to anyone, if we were having a beer, is, okay, is there any part of your heart that you feel most connected to God's? And then I would ask a second question is, how do you know that's God's heart? Because it probably is, because it doesn't make sense to your rational self. There's something about it. I don't know why, but and it might not be a people group. It could be a place. It could be an issue. It could be, you can live in an affluent area and there's people in need all around you. Trauma, mental health, it doesn't discriminate based on zip code. But part of it is just like, and if you're not close to God's heart, then the question is, how do I get close to God's heart? I think you have to spend time with the Lord, and you have to be willing to go there. That's why I talked about vulnerability. Like we talk about this with entrepreneurs. Gosh, Kurt Thompson's been a huge sort of friend and advocate and mentor. And we learn to tell our stories more truthfully. And most of the things I've accomplished have come on the back end of many failures, a lot of failures. I read this quote yesterday, Roger Federer, famous tennis player. And he said, I've won 80% of my singles matches. But he says, do you know what percentage of points I've won within those matches? 54%. So basically 1 out of 2. He says that the thing is, you have to be all in on the point that you're playing, but as soon as you lose it, you have to just brush it off your back and go on to the next one. And I feel like if there's any enduring quality that the Lord has taught me, both personally with our family and professionally, it's resilience. Keep getting up off the mat. Keep getting off the mat. And I think success comes from people who get off the mat more times than people who don't. People think success is not having a lot of failures. Success is usually the back end of having more failures than everyone else, but you just kept coming back. You just kept coming back. And so that would be my encouragement.
There's a lot of fathers, grandfathers, mothers, grandmothers listening to this podcast. How do you transfer those values? What do you model? What kind of conversations do you have that help get the message across?
Yeah, my wife Ravi's been my hero on this one. She does this so well, and it's something we've both had to learn, but she's just done the master's class on it, which is like learning how to lead with vulnerability. So I think oftentimes when our children are making a mistake or doing something we wish they wouldn't do, or not performing at the level we think we can, our instinct is to correct, to instruct and correct, to instruct and correct. Hey, don't do it this way, do it this way. And sometimes it's but essentially critiqued in the hopes that it improves performance. And she's just learned and become gifted at sitting with them in the pain. 8 times out of 10, your child feels, they might not externally exhibit it, but they feel the embarrassment or the shame or the disappointment of them not doing what they could have done or should have done. They feel it often from you, but they feel it from themselves. So what she does, and what I'm learning to do with her, is remove the shame that they might feel from us, because that's not helpful. Shame is a total debilitator when it comes to creative response. It inhibits it, it constrains it, it distorts it. So there's no shame. And then the second is, then they're left with just their own shame. And what you want to do with that is actually sit with them in their pain, and just sitting and being with them without trying to solve it, without trying to correct it. You watch them emotionally start to process it. And when they can hold that, then they can move forward. And that vulnerability leads them to a better creative response. I see that with entrepreneurs that are like on their third venture, learning how to like, how do I steward this vulnerability on this third thing that I want to do? And I'm trying to raise money. And I see it with our 16-year-old daughter, helping her navigate some life issue. They both require vulnerability, but what the person being vulnerable needs is to know that they feel seen, safe, soothed, and secure, as Kurt Thompson would say. And that's just sitting them in their vulnerability. And that requires you to be vulnerable too.
You have stepped into the pain of this city. I've seen it. And in particular, you have some new ventures. You're blowing up Praxis locally, but also with Polk Stables. Tell us about your vision there, why you're sacrificing in those regards as you step into the city, and what's your vision for what that will do, not only through the dense network that you're creating at Citizen 7, as we're trying to foster dense network, men coming together and out of their affection, loving on the city, but also what your vision and what you hope will be the outcome in the long game with those ventures.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So Polk Stables is this building managed by Cohatch at 16th and really where it intersects in the Monon Trail. And it used to be a former 3-story milk factory, which we've now opened into a beautiful co-working space for artists and entrepreneurs. So if you're looking for office space or looking for a co-working membership, you should check out Polk Stables. You're going to love it. It was a crumbling building, but it had this incredible legacy. The Polk family was such a blessing to the city of Indianapolis. They ran the 4th largest dairy, employed a number of people in that Martindale-Brightwood neighborhood. They were known for compassion, innovation, beauty, both from a manufacturing standpoint, but also being just really kind and generous employers to largely an African-American workforce. And rather than see that building leveled to the ground, Greg and myself and Cohatch came together and we not only invested in the building, but developed it. And so there's 3 things that I'm hoping there. One, you have artists that'll be making art in there. And there's a beautiful folklore museum. There'll be an art studio. We're going to run these kind of residencies for artists to come for 48 hours and also for 30 days from hopefully around the world to make and create beautiful art here for our city. But they're going to be surrounded by co-working folks, a lot of entrepreneurs that are in the midst of growing their ventures. I want the artists to help the entrepreneurs to imagine differently. If we're going to build ventures that solve some significant issues and challenges in our city, we need a different imagination. And I think artists do that really well. The artists could benefit from the entrepreneurs because they need help making their hobby into a sustainable venture. And so entrepreneurs naturally think in terms of like product, market, sales. And then Matchbook, we're opening a high school this fall called The Match. And it'll be a vocational themes high school. So we'll have a number of vocational tracks that high schoolers can pursue, like advanced manufacturing or computer science or entrepreneurship as one, computer science, et cetera. But I want some of those kids to intern and apprentice at Polk Stables because we want the next generation coming up in Indy to think imaginally about how art and commerce come together to pursue the redemptive edge. And so let's grow our talent pipeline. Remember that DNA that I talked about? The DNA is in the water. It's here in Indy. And that desire to sacrifice is also here, which unlocks creative potential. So really, we just need more people helping connecting those dots. If that DNA is here and we know that sacrifice leads to creative potential, then really it's just requiring each of us to be a little bit more vulnerable. To Don's point about how do I have a heart for what God wants? Be vulnerable. Be open to receiving his heart. Share where your heart breaks. And if it's not breaking anywhere, spend more time with the Lord and enter that vulnerability. Enter people who are vulnerable. And I don't care, the hardest heart, like your heart eventually is going to start to, as you get to know people relationally, it's hard to be cold to them. That's just how the Holy Spirit works. And I think so much of what we learn on Sunday in a pew needs to actually implement during the week. We practice things like confession and worship and prayer and sitting next to each other on Sundays. And then the rest of our week looks totally different from that. But we can practice those elements. I can practice right here on this couch next to Greg. I can practice confession with Greg. I can practice prayer with Greg. I can practice worship. I can practice listening and learning to his heart. And over time, that will move my heart. And so it's not a coincidence. We're invested in some of the same things together because through friendship, both of our hearts have impacted what we're vulnerable to. And I think that's the beautiful thing about vulnerability. We think about it as a weakness, but in a way, in God's economy, like I was saying, leave the 99 and go after one. God's economy, vulnerability is actually a strength. Now you can get burned by it, but actually, if you learn how to steward it, you learn how to appropriately share it, it actually becomes this creative, imaginative force because you're willing to move. And that's the only reason I'm here in Indianapolis. It makes no sense if you were with me at any earlier parts in my journey, other than the fact that I was willing to open myself to God's heart. And I feel he directed us, me, and as a result, our family here because of the willingness to be vulnerable. And it doesn't mean you're always successful. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of failures that lead to an eventual success. But actually receiving his heart is worth it. It's not just worth the success, it's actually worth all the failures. And I feel like that's the great golden nugget or secret of life that we Christians hold that I wish more and more people would get to know and experience.
I wish we had more time if I can just close this out.
Go ahead.
No, just close out because Sajan, you are pressing into new territory, and it's through these relationships, these vulnerable relationships with Folklore, with Joanna Taft and the Harrison Center, partners in this collision that you don't know what the outcome will be long-term between art and industry and the community. Key partnership there with Matchbook, your new high school, partnering with companies and businesses to give real trade experience.
Yeah.
Real skills. We don't have that in our city.
No.
So it's through those partnerships, and that's what we're trying to do in Citizen 7 is help foster these dense networks, intentional collisions, sometimes serendipitous collisions that lead to something bigger than what anyone can ever imagine. And so I just want to commend you for pressing in from that vulnerable stance, saying, let's take a chance on being human with each other and see what God can do through that.
That's great.
If people want to wade into the local network of Praxis, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, great question. So the easiest entry point, there's a couple entry points, I would say. We run a Friday breakfast. The 1st and 3rd of the month, it's at Polk Stables. The 2nd and 4th, it's at Illinois Street Food Emporium at 7 a.m. There is a local Praxis website with all of our events, which we'll put in the show notes. That'll list all these things. And there's no technical RSVP, but if you go to the website, there is a way to give us your email information and then we can get you on mailing list for that. Come work at Polk Stables. If you go to cohatch.com, you can see the Polk Stables building eventually and set up a tour. Come. We'd love for you to work in the space.
You have an office there.
I have an office there.
Really cool space.
Matchbook and the Match are always looking for mentors. And so we can put links to Matchbook and the Match as well. And then we'll do some big events too. We did a showcase that showcased kind of our latest entrepreneurs.
Chris had 90 seconds of fame there.
I was going to say, Chris and his wife have been coming to our church, but I got to know Chris a little bit better through Builders and Backers. We're hoping to do that again. So if you have an idea and you want to figure out how to prototype an idea into a possible for-profit or non-profit business, then we partner with Builders and Backers out of DC, and they run a redemptive cohort.
It was absolutely huge for me at a moment where I was like, man, I got an idea, but I don't know how to give this form or structure. And by the end, it was a totally different idea, but it was way better. Like it just was. Builders and Backers was such a great program for everybody that was involved in it. We all keep in touch, and everybody was local. So yeah, Builders and Backers definitely worth looking up.
And that's another example of vulnerability for Chris, for you to take the idea out of your head, express it to people, get feedback is vulnerable because people are like, they can either say that's a great idea.
Donna told me my idea was bad. She was very nice about it, but it was a bad idea. And it was like the week before the funding was due, and I had to scramble, and then she talked me through it, and I walked down and went, this is 90 days. What was going on? I was a little mad, but she was right. She was like, this is not what you actually want to do. This is not actually the redemptive idea. And then her and Nick helped me form and shape it into something that has been amazing. We have live podcasts here because live in-person podcasting, I think, is really important for building relationships. And we didn't have a lot of people at the beginning of June, but it was the best one because it's the people who had been coming back that don't have friends that were there and trading cards and connecting. And like that to me was the best one. It didn't matter that there wasn't a lot of people there. It was the people who needed that connection point with other humans was really cool. And that's a direct result of Builders and Backers and the Praxis Network meeting Emily in this space. Yeah, it's what you all are doing is a huge encouragement to a lot of young guys who have ideas but don't know how to get to that next step. C7 Praxis has been just huge for me. And I know when I talk to other young guys, it's just great to meet, to gain some wisdom from people who are doing what we all want to do, but just don't know how to get there yet.
That's great.
Sajan is shaping me now. Don has been shaping me for 40 years. And so if there's any time left, I'd yield my time to Don if you had a closing thought, because Citizen 7 is all about what Sajan's doing. We just thank God that he's here, but what we're trying to do is create this ecosystem of an extraordinary city that's bursting with life in all of its domains, from poverty to riches, from black and white and brown, men and women together in a vibrant city. And Don and his thinking has really shaped me. And that's the basis for Citizen 7, our relationship together. And now with me and Sajan, with Polk Stables, workshipping, as I say, helping create workship through Polk and through Praxis is really beautiful.
All right, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. Don, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
No, I think the
last comment, the person really challenged me. It says, what is it that we need to do together that you can't do alone? Mm-hmm. And you look at almost any venture, whether it's social venture or commercial venture, that it's with others. Yeah, and so we hope that Citizen 7, that I was with Mike Pence, had the pleasure of being with Vice President Mike Pence for a small Bible study just a couple days ago. And we were talking about engagement, and he says his admonishment was, don't wait to be asked. So people listening, in terms of take the initiative, go ask somebody, go ask for help, go ask for collaboration, coffee, but remember that there's so many things, whether it's loving people, caring for the disenfranchised, taking care of your neighbor, that you're going to be doing it with others, not by yourself.
There you go.
All right, with that, thanks so much for being here, Sajan. We appreciate it. Thanks on behalf of Don and Greg for being with us. And if you're listening on YouTube or the audio feed, make sure you join us the 4th Monday at noon. You can sign up through heartbeat.chat or join the email list. And you can get in on that by joining up at citizen7indy.com. All right, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you again here on Big Hearted Indy.